My name is Mark Henderson, and the strangest thing about being fired at 60 wasn't the words they used or the room they chose. It was the way my body stayed calm while something essential collapsed inside me, quietly, permanently, like a support beam snapping behind finished walls. When Oliver Green told me I was set in my ways and Laura Scott avoided my eyes, I felt a numb heat spread through my chest. Not anger yet, just the slow realization that 30 years of loyalty had been reduced to an inconvenience they could escort out with practiced smiles. I walked away with my coat folded neatly over my arm, my badge placed gently on the table, my voice steady as I reminded them that companies run on people, while inside I was inventorying everything I had just lost, my authority, my future, the identity I had built since my 30s, understanding with a frightening clarity that nothing I said would save it and nothing I did would be loud enough to matter. I didn't feel the urge to fight or beg or explain, because something colder had already taken its place, something patient and watchful, and as the elevator doors closed, I understood that silence wasn't surrender, it was preparation. And that was the moment I stopped trying to survive.
I am Mark, and even now I can replay that morning from too many angles at once, like my mind refuses to settle on a single version because none of them feel survivable on their own. I remember what I saw first. Oliver Green standing at the head of the table in the New York meeting room, hands clasped, posture rehearsed, the faintest smile already waiting for the end of the conversation. Laura Scott to his right, her tablet angled like a shield, nodding at moments that hadn't earned agreement yet. I noticed the glass wall behind them, the city moving on without me, and how the chair across from them felt smaller than it should have, as if it had been chosen carefully. What I felt came later. At first, there was only calm, a professional calm I had perfected over decades of negotiations, layoffs, restructurings, the kind that makes other people believe you are in control even when you aren't. My hands rested flat on the table. My breathing stayed even. Inside, something fragile began to crack. I remember what I didn't say. I didn't remind them that Henderson and Moore Solutions had my name on the door because I had built it when no one else wanted to risk their reputation. I didn't say that the systems they now praised were frameworks I designed during nights when my children were asleep and my marriage was already paying the price. I didn't ask why the word modern suddenly meant disposable. I pretended not to notice that Laura never once said the word thank you. I pretended not to see the legal phrasing embedded in Oliver's casual tone, each sentence already cleared, already approved. I smiled when appropriate. I nodded once. I said very little. The disturbing detail didn't hit me until later that afternoon, when I opened the folder they handed me and realized the decision had been finalized weeks earlier. Dates, signatures, a succession plan that skipped over everyone I had mentored. Anthony Reed's name absent, Sarah Miller listed as transitional, James Collins reduced to a cost center. They hadn't just removed me. They had quietly erased the structure that had grown around me, and they had done it while I was still walking the halls, still shaking hands, still believing I was needed. That realization settled like a weight behind my eyes. This wasn't impulsive. It wasn't about innovation. It was about control. Outwardly, I was graceful. I thanked them for the opportunity. I wished them success. I walked through the office one last time without stopping at any desk. Inside, I felt my identity tearing loose from the routine that had defined my mornings for 3 decades. No meetings to prepare for, no teams waiting for direction, no place where my judgment carried weight. I understood then that what they had taken wasn't just a role, it was my future usefulness. the quiet authority that comes with being trusted, the sense that experience accumulates into something permanent. It doesn't. It can be deleted. That evening, alone in my apartment, the shock finally caught up with me. I sat in the dark and replayed every moment, searching for the precise second where I could have changed the outcome, knowing, even as I searched, that there wasn't one. My phone stayed silent. No calls from Oliver, no follow-up from Laura. The absence felt intentional, designed. I thought about the people still inside those walls, relying on processes no one fully understood except me, and I felt a strange, restrained anger, not explosive, not loud, but heavy, the kind that sinks and waits. I asked myself a question I couldn't shake. What would you do if the humiliation didn't end when you walked away? Because it didn't. It followed me home. It sat with me in the quiet. It rewrote my past in ways I couldn't yet correct. And somewhere beneath the numbness, a clearer understanding formed. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't misunderstanding or progress. It was a planned removal, executed with smiles. And as that truth settled in, I realized something else with terrifying certainty. This story wasn't over, and the people who believed it was had no idea what they had already set in motion.
The first few weeks after leaving the office were strangely revealing. From a distance, I could see Oliver Green and Laura Scott relax, confident that the most difficult part, removing me, was complete. They celebrated quietly, reassured by the absence of dissenting voices, believing they had replaced decades of institutional knowledge with modern efficiency. What they didn't realize was that invisibility can be far more dangerous than confrontation. I watched, listened, cataloged. Every casual remark, every overconfident smile, every decision made without full comprehension became data. They were underestimating me, and that mistake would cost them. I began a quiet observation phase. Conferences, client meetings, industry events. My presence was minimal, my involvement neutral. People saw me as a retired executive, a harmless observer of the world I had once dominated. They didn't notice how much I understood, how sharply I analyzed every move, how I memorized the weaknesses they believed they had hidden. Their laughter, their misplaced confidence, their careless assumptions, they were all visible to me. I didn't need to intervene yet. The timing wasn't right. The first tangible ripple came from a single UK client I had worked with for years. When asked for reassurance about the firm's new leadership, I stayed silent, offering no endorsement. That pause was enough. Doubt crept in. The client requested additional documentation, delayed approvals, and began quietly questioning leadership decisions that had always been seamless. The effects weren't immediate, but they were precise. I had planted a seed that would grow without any dramatic confrontation. Meanwhile, I accepted a discreet advisory role with a firm that indirectly competed with Henderson and Moore in one critical niche. My involvement was invisible. No announcements, no posts, just influence behind the scenes. I wasn't trying to destroy my former company outright. The satisfaction came from watching them misread the situation completely. Every misstep they attributed to external factors, to luck, to market conditions, while I observed the cracks widening exactly as I had anticipated. Within the company, the first signs of real strain began. Internal communications became more cautious, less confident. Junior employees began hesitating before making decisions. Middle managers copied directives to multiple supervisors. The culture I had nurtured, the trust, the efficiency, the quiet authority, was eroding, and yet the leadership team remained blind to the source of their unraveling. They had removed one person and believed all else would follow predictably. They were wrong. The mini-revenge culminated in a subtle but meaningful moment. A key client requested my input in a conference call, ostensibly for historical context. Oliver agreed, confident that I would be courteous and inconsequential.
I answered precisely, filling gaps without covering mistakes, giving just enough information to highlight where the leadership was fumbling. A single question from the client went unanswered on Oliver's end. The silence was telling. It was not explosive, not dramatic, but it conveyed everything. The firm's confidence had begun to fracture, and they didn't even know why. I ended those weeks with no visible celebration, no declarations, no proof that anything had changed. Yet inside, the knowledge was intoxicating. They believed the removal had solved the problem. They thought they had won. But their assumption, their underestimation, had become the first real leverage point in a plan that was only beginning. They didn't see it, but I did. They believed the story had ended. I knew it had only just begun.
By the third month, the subtle tremors I had set in motion began to gain momentum. The company, once confident in its own structure, was showing the first signs of internal collapse. Small errors that would have been corrected instantly now lingered, multiplied by hesitation and uncertainty. Oliver Green overcompensated, sending emails to everyone on the chain, requesting confirmations for decisions that had never needed approval. Laura Scott, meticulous and confident before, now repeated points, sought legal clearance excessively, and second-guessed every minor recommendation. The changes were gradual, imperceptible to anyone outside, but unmistakable to me. I could see the fear creeping in like mist in a quiet corridor, slow, silent, and relentless. I maintained my distance, continued attending industry events with courtesy but no fanfare, keeping my presence neutral, invisible. No one suspected that I was observing every misstep, noting patterns, remembering conversations, and cataloging their predictable reactions. Every miscalculation happened exactly as I had anticipated, yet the executives could only attribute it to chance, never imagining it was deliberate. Silence had become my weapon. Invisible influence was far more devastating than a public confrontation. The ripple effect of the mini-revenge had grown beyond my initial projections. A client in New York, previously confident in the company's internal workflow, began asking for verification of reports. A London partner requested additional documentation due to audit concerns. Meetings dragged longer, emails piled up, deadlines stretched. Confidence within teams eroded quietly, like sand slipping through fingers. They were panicking internally while appearing composed externally, a disconnect I had anticipated and cultivated. Watching this unfold, I could feel a shift within myself. Revenge had altered me subtly but profoundly. I was no longer simply the man they dismissed. I had become patient, calculating, deliberate. My sense of self was now defined by control over the unseen consequences of my actions. Every word I allowed to be spoken in public, every visible step I took, was measured to maximize impact with minimal exposure. Strategy replaced emotion, and foresight became my constant companion. A looming threat made the stakes sharper. A multi-million-dollar deal in London required precise coordination, speed, and trust. I knew exactly where the chain would fail without my guidance. The knowledge of the catastrophic potential of withholding or delaying input was both a weapon and a burden. The weight of this power sharpened my focus. Timing became everything. A single misstep could accelerate the collapse, but done correctly, it would become irreversible. I began to notice the first signs of paranoia creeping into the leadership team. Minor hesitations in decisions, repeated confirmations, over-documentation, all indicators that fear had replaced confidence. Oliver misinterpreted minor setbacks as market volatility. Laura suspected internal sabotage without knowing the real source. Their anxiety was silent but pervasive. Each small failure reinforced my understanding. Invisibility was now more dangerous than confrontation, and patience would outlast impulsive action. By the end of the week, the reality had become unmistakable. Their systems were failing, not because they were incompetent, but because they had lost the one element that held everything together: trust,
grounded in experience. And the most unsettling realization? I still had access to something far more catastrophic, a single nudge or withheld insight that could unravel contracts, credibility, and entire client relationships. The countdown had begun, and the clock was invisible. They believed the storm had passed. They were wrong. The real reckoning was just starting.
By now, the subtle fractures I had sown were becoming visible. Contracts that once renewed automatically were stalling. Internal reports contained errors no one noticed until clients flagged them. Leadership meetings stretched longer and longer, dominated by hesitation and second-guessing. Oliver Green tried to maintain composure, but the change was obvious to anyone watching closely. Even Laura Scott, always polished and careful, stumbled over her words in front of board members, rephrasing points and seeking approvals for issues that had never required them before. The quiet instability that had been invisible in the first weeks was now slipping into the open, and the leadership team couldn't reverse it. I remained outwardly calm, polite, almost distant. The few who contacted me professionally received measured, courteous responses, nothing more, and yet every small interaction reinforced the cracks inside the company. They didn't see it, but I had already set into motion contingencies for every major client, every key internal process. They believed they had the upper hand. The truth was that their supposed victory had been carefully undermined months before I ever walked out of that office. It became clear during a meeting with a US-based partner. The client requested information they had never asked for before. Oliver attempted to respond, but stumbled over details that I had once managed seamlessly. I could see the panic behind his practiced smile. Laura tried to intervene, but her explanations were incomplete, leaving more questions than answers. The conversation ended with a promise to reassess internally. That simple phrase, repeated by multiple clients over the next few weeks, became a harbinger of deeper, irreversible consequences. The chaos wasn't limited to external stakeholders. Internally, teams that had always functioned like clockwork were now misaligned. Deadlines were missed, reports misfiled, approvals delayed. The knowledge that had been centralized in my judgment, in my discretion, was gone. And while they were scrambling, I watched quietly, noting which weaknesses would lead to the largest domino effect. Every tiny miscalculation, every pause, every hesitant response was a signal. The system they trusted was unraveling under the weight of its own overconfidence. And then came the confrontation attempt, subtle but telling. Oliver reached out, a phone call that began with cordiality but ended in thinly veiled threats about client retention and reputational damage. He hinted that I should consider my involvement carefully. I smiled quietly, said nothing that would reveal the extent of my leverage, and let the silence stretch. That call, meant to intimidate, only confirmed what I already knew. They were out of control, and every step they took was predictable. It was at that moment I realized something chilling. Everything I was now observing, everything I had anticipated and allowed to happen, was irreversible. The company was no longer just struggling, it was unraveling, and they were powerless to stop it. Every misjudgment, every blind assumption, every small attempt to cover gaps only accelerated the outcome, and all of it had been in motion long before the first meeting where I had been dismissed. By the end of the week, the visible consequences had grown too large to ignore. Key clients were openly questioning leadership, contracts were delayed indefinitely, and internal morale had dropped sharply. They thought their problem was temporary, a minor correction. They didn't see the quiet inevitability that had been building for months. And even if they did, it was already too late. The structure I had built, the trust I had maintained, the authority I had embodied, they had lost it all, irreversibly.
The tension had reached a point where every decision, every word, every passing day carried the weight of potential collapse. The company teetered on a knife's edge. Deadlines were missed not by chance, but because the people they once relied on no longer trusted themselves. Teams that had always functioned efficiently were now paralyzed by hesitation. Oliver Green sent more emails than he read. Laura Scott's careful demeanor cracked under repeated scrutiny. Each small misstep rippled outward, creating consequences no one could contain. I could feel it all like a pulse, slow but relentless, and I had to keep my own composure perfectly calibrated. One misjudged reaction on my part could undo everything I had meticulously set in motion. There were moments when I questioned myself, when the weight of patient revenge threatened to overwhelm reason. Sitting quietly, reviewing emails, or anticipating the next domino to fall, I felt a flicker of doubt. Was this obsession? Was I losing the part of myself that still felt human, that still deserved peace after decades of dedication? I almost walked away. I almost let them continue, letting the slow unraveling of their empire feel like punishment enough. But the plan demanded completion. The cost had to be paid fully, even if the payment included me changing in ways I could not yet recognize. Every new ripple reminded me of what I had lost: status, authority, recognition. The future I had once seen clearly had vanished. And yet I gained something darker: control, certainty, and the knowledge that invisibility can wield more power than confrontation. As client inquiries increased, as deadlines slipped, as internal confusion deepened, I saw their panic mount. Small cracks became visible fractures. Meetings that were once decisive ended in silence. Presentations I had once overseen flawlessly were now embarrassing performances. They didn't know why. Then it happened. Oliver called a private meeting, clearly frustrated, and confronted someone he suspected was causing disruption. His accusation was vague, his words defensive. He questioned minor procedural delays, trying to trace responsibility like a detective searching for a thief. I watched from the periphery, unseen, knowing fully that every failure he was chasing led directly back to the structure I had once maintained and now deliberately left absent. His eyes flickered with the first true understanding that someone he had dismissed, someone he thought harmless, was orchestrating the unraveling from outside. Laura's realization followed closely. She attempted to regain control by reasserting her authority, to enforce processes they had abandoned. But her interventions were too late, misaligned with client expectations and internal capabilities. Panic grew, not like a roar, but like poison slowly spreading through veins. Every attempt to patch, to reassure, only deepened their vulnerability. They were finally seeing the consequences of underestimating experience and of ignoring the backbone that had quietly maintained their empire for decades. I felt the culmination of months of quiet observation and restrained influence. Every domino I had predicted, every hesitation I had nurtured, every subtle nudge had combined into a system-wide breakdown. And as the leadership team began to piece together that the collapse wasn't random, that someone outside their perception was in control, I could feel the quiet satisfaction of inevitability. This wasn't rage, it wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. It was strategy executed with patience, a reckoning they could neither avoid nor fully comprehend. The most profound moment came in the way Oliver looked at me indirectly through colleagues, searching for the invisible hand he now suspected existed. That first glimmer of recognition, fear mixed with disbelief, was the final confirmation I needed. They understood, finally, that the architect of their unraveling was not a rogue employee, not a consultant, not a system glitch. It was the person they had dismissed with a polite smile and a few words about being set in their ways.
I had become a quiet, inescapable force, and they had only themselves to blame.
By the time the final domino fell, Henderson and Moore Solutions was unrecognizable to those who had once built their confidence on my guidance. Contracts were lost, clients had quietly moved their business elsewhere, and the remaining leadership team scrambled desperately to contain the damage. Their reputation, painstakingly maintained for decades, had fractured under the weight of decisions made without understanding, and the irony was undeniable. The entire collapse had begun months before any visible signs emerged. No alarms, no dramatic confrontations, just the inevitability of consequences silently accumulating. I remained calm throughout, polite in communications, measured in every response, and utterly invisible in the moments that mattered most. There was no celebration, no vindictive display. The satisfaction wasn't in shouting my triumph or pointing fingers. It was in observing the truth emerge, the result of patience, strategy, and the quiet power of being underestimated. I didn't need anyone to thank me. They didn't deserve it. What they had dismissed as old-fashioned wisdom had proven irreplaceable. The final blow came in subtle professional shifts, clients confirming terminations, partners refusing extensions, and internal teams openly expressing doubt in leadership. Oliver Green and Laura Scott were left with an empire they could no longer manage, scrambling to salvage relationships and credibility. Emails went unanswered, promises broken, systems failed. All of it could have been prevented if they had valued experience over ego. All of it had been preventable, yet no one could stop the inevitable once it had begun. As I watched from the periphery, the quiet satisfaction was tempered with reflection. I had lost my career, my status, my predictable future. I had been dismissed at 60 with barely a nod to the decades of work that had sustained the company. But I had reclaimed something equally important: dignity, control, and the confirmation that patience and silence often wield more power than anger or confrontation. The lesson was clear: underestimate the person who leaves quietly, and the consequences will arrive without warning. And in that calm, inevitable unraveling, the moral became undeniable. The most devastating revenge is not visible. It doesn't scream, it doesn't demand attention. It waits, it observes, it grows, and when the time is right, it arrives with precision. The loudest revenge I ever took wasn't words, wasn't confrontation. It was the quiet certainty that comes when experience is dismissed and the world discovers too late that what it ignored cannot be replaced. The company would never fully recover, and I walked away not shouting, not celebrating, but knowing with absolute clarity that they had learned the cost of underestimating someone they thought powerless. The loudest revenge I ever took was saying nothing.